You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, editor-at-large at The Diplomat, and I am taping today from Washington, D.C. So listeners of this podcast might recall that we spent quite a bit of time talking about the South China Sea, which, of course, being one of Asia's primary flashpoints, certainly makes sense. In fact, if I recall correctly, way back in February 2014 when we started this podcast, the very first episode was discussing the state of the South China Sea and disputes there. And so I'm glad to return to the topic today, but what I'm especially glad about is the guest joining me today. I'm sure many of our readers and listeners of The Diplomat will be familiar with Bill Hayton, an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House and the author of one of the best books on the South China Sea. I'll put a link to Bill's book in the show notes. Bill's done a tremendous amount of digging in the archives, looking at the historical origins of Chinese and other claims in the South China Sea region. So, Bill, it's really a pleasure to welcome you to the Asia Geopolitics podcast. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you. I normally listen to your podcast when I'm going for a run, so it's quite nice to be on it rather than just listening to it, I suppose. I guess this is one episode I won't be listening to.
Well, yeah, you never know. I mean, you might want to listen to yourself, not being out of breath if you're on a run.
Yeah.
So, no, but anyways, I really appreciate it. And actually, the topic, Bill, today, just for our listeners, is, we're a little bit behind the anniversary, but earlier this month, in July 2021, we hit the 5-year anniversary of the landmark ruling by a tribunal of 5 judges at the Hague-based Permanent Court of Arbitration back in 2016, on July 12, 2016 to be precise. This was the unanimous award by the tribunal in the Republic of Philippines versus the People's Republic of China, a case filed in 2013 by Manila concerning maritime entitlements and the status of features, among other issues, in the South China Sea. So, Bill, look, I will kind of give you the floor. I know that our listeners will be aware of the ruling, but the finer details, particularly the legal significance and what exactly the ruling decided at the time, I'll sort of leave that to you. So if you don't mind, can you give us your best sort of, 2-3 minute spiel on why this ruling was significant and what it did?
Yeah, great, thank you. It was a very clever piece of legal work by the Philippines, and they had some very clever and, I imagine, expensive advice from international lawyers. So what they were very careful to do was say, we want a case that says nothing at all about who owns the islands, the rocks and the reefs, because this tribunal wouldn't be able to handle that. Then what they wanted to do was say, in the spaces in between the rocks and the reefs in the sea, who has the rights to the resources? And this was powered by the fact that there's thought to be a very large gas field under a piece of seabed called the Reed Bank off the Philippines coast, which the Philippines wants to exploit, and China was basically stopping them, and that was largely the driving force behind it. And so they went to something called, they called for an international arbitral tribunal. Now, often people talk about this as the PCA, or the Permanent Court of Arbitration, which isn't strictly accurate, but that organization, the PCA, was the secretariat for this international arbitral tribunal. And by the time all the legal kind of thinking had been gone through, the Philippines was asking for clarification on 15 points, some of which were quite specific, but there were 2 really broad ones. One was, did any of the rocks or reefs in the southern part of the South China Sea, the Spratly Islands and Scarborough Shoal, which is an isolated sort of coral reef, did they constitute islands in the full legal sense? Does that mean, and did they generate an exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles or approximately 400 kilometers around them? Could they? Was it possible? The other thing was, China has this U-shaped line or 9-dash line drawn on its maps in the South China Sea. Could that line mean anything in an international legal sense? Could it be a claim on resources? And on both of those 2 points, and on another 12 points, so in total 14 out of the 15, the judges ruled in the Philippines' favor. They said there was nothing in the law of the sea, UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that would allow China to simply draw a line in the sea and say all of the fish and resources in this line are ours. And then they also said that none of the little islands or islets, might say, in the southern part are able to sustain human habitation or an economic life. But that's the phrase in UNCLOS. And so therefore they couldn't generate an exclusive economic zone. So therefore, ultimately, up to 200 nautical miles away from the coast of the Philippines, all the fish, all the oil and gas resources underneath it belong to the Philippines. in broad sense, except for small little areas around each individual disputed feature. And that was a huge win for the Philippines. And it basically said that a lot of what China has been trying to do over the last sort of 20, 30 years was, I'm not sure whether they would use illegal, but certainly not supported by international law. The slight catch in this is it's only binding on China and the Philippines. So at the moment, Vietnam can't use this, or Malaysia, or Brunei, or Indonesia. But I imagine if they were to bring a similar case to a similar tribunal, then the judges might rule in a similar way, depending on who the judges were, of course.
Yeah, that is a question that I want to actually get to later in this discussion today about what the legacy of this ruling tells other countries about the potential value of using international law as a tool to deal with their disputes with China on these legal matters. Before we move on, Bill, though, I did want to ask you, because at the time the ruling came out, we were about 18 to 24 months since news of China's land reclamation activities at 7 features in the Spratly Islands became widely known, and this was something that the tribunal also handled up front, including the environmental effects of that activity. Could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the case was unveiled in January 2013, and I think the first sort of signs we had of Chinese vessels actually doing dredging and building on any of the reefs was about I think September to 9 months later in 2013. Some people say that it was, the island building was a response to the Philippines bringing this tribunal case. But I mean, there's no way they could have, done the plans, organized the dredgers, all that kind of stuff in 9 months. They'd clearly been, looking to do it for a long time before that. But they were able to kind of use the lodging of the tribunal as saying, well, if you're going to do this, then we're going to, cement our claim, literally. So yeah, they carried on doing that. The most important part of the arbitral ruling, in relating to the artificial islands, was that there's one of the 3 large bases the Chinese have built is on a feature called Mischief Reef, which is the closest one to the Philippines, to the island of Palawan. And it's a low tide elevation, i.e. in its natural state. And this is what the tribunal was asked to rule on. In its natural state, was it an island? And they said, no, it's a low tide elevation. All the sort of previous sort of mariners' charts or descriptions had said it's covered at high tide. Therefore, it's not an island. It doesn't generate any exclusive economic zone. And then basically it says that since this is not an island capable of being owned, it belongs to the Philippines because it's in their exclusive economic zone. So China should abandon it. And I guess that's probably the part of the ruling that I can see as being least likely to be actually abided by, because obviously China has spent, I'd have thought, probably at least $1 billion or so building that base, and I can hardly see them giving it up voluntarily. They may be prepared to make concessions on other aspects, but that's going to be a real thorn, I think, for the two countries' relations for a long time to come.
Right. So we've talked a little bit about what happened and what was decided on July 12, 2016. Let's now shift gears to talk a little bit about the last 5 years in the South China Sea. Obviously a topic that, could be the subject of many podcasts. And, for listeners, I will also include in the show notes just some of the writing and reporting we did at The Diplomat on the contents of the ruling, if you are interested in that. But Bill, maybe the place to start here is with the Philippines, because I remember the summer of 2016 quite vividly, because I was doing a lot of writing on the South China Sea and following this ruling. And of course, we had a presidential transition in the Philippines that year. In fact, I think it was June 30th when Rodrigo Duterte was welcomed into office, and his outgoing predecessor, Benigno Aquino III, had been the most vocal proponent of this process at the International Tribunal. And the rest is history, as they say. But looking back in 5 years from now, that transition, I think, had quite a bit of an effect. I think it's fair to say on the way in which the Philippines dealt with the outcome of the tribunal ruling. Tell us a little bit. In hindsight, when the history of this era is written, how significant is that transition from Aquino to Duterte likely to be when we think about this ruling, and potentially the counterfactual scenario where we might have had a different Philippine president who'd taken a greater interest in the ruling? How did things play out?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was absolutely critical. I mean, the Philippines has this strange electoral system where they have a multi-candidate presidential election, but only one round. So if there were five candidates, I think, back in 2016, and you can win by getting, a third of the vote because you just get more than the largest number of any of the candidates. There's no second round runoff like in, say, France. And so he wins on a minority of the vote. I mean, there was a time, a couple of weeks when theoretically he could maybe have even cancelled the whole legal process, and that all of those, years of legal argument would have been wasted. But he didn't. He kind of went through it. I could have foreseen if another candidate had won that the ruling would have been the plank of a more assertive Philippine strategy towards China, where they would have been able to marshal a coalition of countries in the region, countries outside the region, in support of the principle of international law and the rights of small countries to exploit their own resources without the pressure from big countries. If they'd been portrayed in that way, they could have probably gathered quite a bit of support. But as it was, Mr. Duterte came in and he very much espoused a sort of Philippines first policy. And this wasn't just about sort of downgrading relations with the US, although that got most of the publicity. I mean, he was very scornful of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, working collectively. Vietnam had been very pleased that the Philippines was making the running on this legal strategy, and it could just kind of quietly hide behind them. And all of a sudden, you had a president who wasn't going to make use of this ruling, and everybody else kind of felt, I guess, sort of naked, really. And other countries around the world, I mean, for example, European countries, who might have sort of stepped up and said, we support the application of international law in all places. Suddenly they think, well, you can't be more Catholic than the Pope if the Philippines isn't going to stand up and defend its rights granted by this ruling. Then why should the EU or any other country stand up and shout about it either? So yeah, it really kind of took the wind out of the sails of this, what could have been quite a sort of gathering movement in defense of international law.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite bits of kind of, I guess not really Arcana, but I recall that the Taiwanese made a somewhat last-minute submission on the status of Itu Aba, or Taiping Island, which I believe also delayed the date of the ruling actually emerging. There was a small chance that it might have actually emerged before the presidential transition in the Philippines, but alas, that was not to be.
Yeah, so that little piece of arcana there that you mentioned about the judges kind of taking in this Taiwanese intervention. I mean, they really did try to kind of anticipate any arguments that China might use, because China was refusing to participate in the ruling. So, for example, when a Chinese diplomat sent a letter to the judges, well, they sort of incorporated that into their arguments. And they wanted to hear, even though Taiwan doesn't have any legal standing at the UN or whatever, they accepted this letter to kind of consider the arguments about the status of Itu Aba, the largest of the Spratly Islands, as a way of being seen to sort of kind of bend over backwards to try and take into account all the possible arguments that China might have deployed had it been willing to take part in the process.
Mm-hmm. So at the time of the ruling, despite the transition in the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte's views on the United States, on China, weren't necessarily a surprise by the time he entered office. But, I recall at the time, a lot of analysts obviously celebrated the ruling, saw it as an important victory for international law and for the right of, smaller countries to equalize their interests against larger powers like China. But ultimately, as you said, the status of features on the ground has really not changed in the South China Sea. China maintains its, 7 artificial islands in the Spratlys. It has continued to improve infrastructure, proceed with the militarization of these facilities. Philippines-China relations have obviously continued under Duterte, despite a few bumps in the road that we've covered in this podcast before. But, Bill, if you had to assess, overall, how successful China has been in sort of managing the fallout of this ruling. What's your take? I mean, obviously, this ruling remains on the historical record. It is now part of international law precedent for not only the South China Sea, but international maritime law more broadly. But if you're Beijing, I mean, your interests in the South China Sea really necessarily haven't been affected too negatively. So what's your take on how China has really played its cards in the last 5 years?
Yeah. I think your basic summary is, that I mean, they still occupy those seven very capable military bases. They are able to swarm boats around other countries' oil and gas exploration efforts, or fishing boat confrontations have become a regular occurrence. So in that sense, the and of course. The basis for the reason why the Philippines brought this case to try and develop the Reed Bank gas reserves, they remain undeveloped. So the Philippines hasn't been able to leverage this ruling really in any significant way that would benefit its own people. Um, China's image clearly has suffered quite a lot. I mean, it's sort of seen, I guess, more clearly as being its policies as running against this ruling, and which just simply adds to the general concern about its behaviour in the region more generally. But it's been able to, just sort of, to use an English expression, to cock a snook at international law, and get away with it. And that's because, obviously, there is no global police force that is sort of mandated to go and enforce these rulings, unless, say, for example, a UN Security Council resolution is passed. And of course, China has a veto on a UN Security Council resolution, so it's very unlikely ever to get passed. I mean, I would say, I hold my hands up and say that I was an optimist at the beginning. I sort of thought that given the way that states had generally behaved with similar rulings, for example, Russia, had an adverse ruling in the case of a Greenpeace vessel, the Arctic Sunrise, denounced it and then kind of quietly found a way to comply. I mean, the Brits had an adverse ruling about the PCA about Diego Garcia, and then they sort of found a way to kind of comply, at least on paper. Even going back to the International Court of Justice ruling against the United States on mining the harbors of Nicaragua back in the 1980s. They denounced it, said they weren't going to comply, and then, in the end, when the government changed, they paid what they didn't call compensation, but they called it aid, and the issue went away. So the kind of history has been that big states generally try and comply with even rulings they don't like. But China has basically, stuck up its middle finger and refused to comply on so many levels, and there hasn't been much of any form of sanction, I suppose. Just sort of rhetorical condemnation, and it's been part of a hardening of attitudes
Yeah.
towards Beijing.
Yeah, I mean, under Xi Jinping, I mean, I think one of the common trends in Chinese statecraft has been to show really no interest in the slightest degree of compromise on China's so-called core interests, and the South China Sea has, I think, definitely seen some of that as well. But I mean, I think this is a good segue to return to that question that came up earlier in our discussion today, which is, when if you're in Hanoi and you're sort of looking at the last 5 years and the value of international law in sort of dealing with one's grievances with China, what do you take away from this? I mean, what is the likelihood of other countries, other claimants, resorting to international tribunals, arbitration in the future to contend with these issues? Right? It's not just Vietnam, Indonesia, other countries. What are they thinking?
Well, let's start with Vietnam, and I think the answer there is highly, highly unlikely. I mean, Vietnam and China have this special relationship. They're both run by communist parties. They have this party-to-party relationship, which is more important than their state-to-state relationship. And it would be seen, I think, as a monumental kind of piece of grandstanding by the Vietnamese to do that. I think the Chinese would take it extraordinarily badly. I mean, the Vietnamese have more or less abandoned any idea of drilling for oil and gas on the, let's call it the Chinese side of the U-shaped line, and I mean that kind of in strongly in inverted commas, the disputed area, you might say. And so, in effect, China has asserted a kind of a monopoly over, certainly regarding the Vietnamese, over oil and gas exploration in the disputed areas. Vietnam has kind of caved because it doesn't want to provoke a confrontation, because there are more important things to the party in the Vietnam-China relationship than simply the South China Sea. They would wish it were otherwise, but given their unwillingness to jump wholeheartedly into some kind of alliance with any other country, they'll work hard to maintain kind of stable relationships with China. As regards other countries, I mean, potentially Indonesia, Brunei, and Malaysia could all bring similar cases based on what China's been doing. And I think they all basically take the view that in the round, their relationship with China has sort of pluses and minuses, and they'll accept the minuses on the South China Sea if they can get the positives, in terms of trade, I guess, and the sort of big economic questions in other parts of the relationship. I mean, the Indonesians, for example, would have, I'd have thought, a clear case when China or Chinese Coast Guard vessels, for example, protect Chinese fishing boats operating off the Natuna Islands at the very sort of southwestern end of the U-shaped line. I mean, it's clearly a violation of UNCLOS by almost anyone who's reading it, except the people in Beijing, and yet they haven't been willing to do it. They've been willing to do things like capture fishing boats that are really egregiously operating in the wrong areas and blow some of them up in the past. And I think that most of those that were blown up were Southeast Asian boats, and I think only one or two were Chinese. So I mean, they've all been extremely cautious about talking about legal rights. From time to time, you hear a rumor that the Vietnamese are really thinking about this time they finally will bring a legal case, but it's kind of I think it's diplomatic saber rattling, really. It's about sort of sending a message. No, this time we really are desperately unhappy with what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen several rounds of what I would describe as fairly dramatic crises, I suppose, involving Vietnam and China. And if that hasn't tilted the needle in Hanoi, I don't think anything really will in the short term. So I think I share your assessment there. Before we come to the end of the discussion, I did want to bring in the United States a little bit. We had this interesting development in 2020 where the Trump administration reviewed American policy towards the South China Sea and really updated it to bring it in line with the findings of the 2016 Tribunal. This sort of began with a note verbal at the UN submitted by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. But broadly speaking, the U.S. has sort of maintained its traditional focus on freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea, but also broadened its scope more broadly to the freedom of the seas, focusing on the right of claimant states to exploit resources that are rightfully theirs, including supporting Vietnam against, quote, Chinese bullying over hydrocarbon exploitation and so forth. If you had to sort of give the Biden administration pointers on how this ruling might usefully inform the United States strategy in the South China Sea, not just bilaterally with China, but also in terms of approaching other claimant states, approaching Southeast Asian countries, the Philippines, an American ally. What would you have to say about the value of this ruling there? I mean, does this really continue to have importance for the United States per se, or is U.S. policy in this region better served by through other means?
I absolutely agree with what I think is the thrust behind your question, which is that so the US, I think, historically has seen its interest in the region in quite narrow terms. Things like freedom of navigation, the rights of military vessels to sail through the South China Sea unimpeded. Also, the security of treaty allies, I guess, thinking about the Philippines, but also Japan and potentially, I guess, even Thailand as an actual treaty ally. Whereas the countries in the region are thinking more about the economic value they get from the South China Sea, plus also the kind of the concern about China becoming too overbearing in the region. And so by putting themselves behind the interests of the Southeast Asian countries and saying, well, we're just as concerned about your ability to manage fish stocks or to exploit your oil and gas reserves, as you are. Clearly, they're trying to align themselves with the regional agenda. Whether it will be enough, I'm not entirely sure, because no matter how much the United States does in the region, there's this sort of latent perception among Southeast Asians that China is always going to be here and the US is always going to be on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And at some point, the Americans may go home, and here, Southeast Asians will say, well, the United States left in 1975, from Indochina. What's to say it won't happen again, or, in some other kind of framework. So none of the Southeast Asians are ever going to kind of jump completely into bed with the United States. And so there's always going to be a kind of a gap between what the US can promise and what the Southeast Asians will take from that promise, if you like. There's, kind of whether they really will deliver on, whether it be sort of military aid of some kind, or even kind of economic muscle. So I think the one thing I think that the US has to do is what I've heard called, full spectrum engagement, not just talking about freedom of navigation operations or military support. Southeast Asians want vaccines. They want for COVID. They want economic support. They want agricultural advice and access to markets. All this kind of stuff. They're kind of the things that now China is getting much better at doing. And I think there's been a tendency to kind of sit back and kind of assume that the way that the US engaged with the region would just carry on and that would be fine, and not really seeing, I think, how much the ground has shifted in Southeast Asia, how much China has upped its game on lots of different levels, not just the economic, but in other ways too, and for the US to kind of to catch up. And I think the US has got to demonstrate that it's, and frankly other countries, even the Europeans, that they've got skin in the game, that a policy which is just based on very expensive military deployments into the foreseeable future, it's how, in an English expression, I don't know if it's used, how is it going to wash its face? Who's actually going to pay for this? What are the actual material benefits that the American economy gets from engagement in Southeast Asia? Is it just going to be a loss leader, that they're just going to spend lots of money on ships and planes, and expect the American taxpayer to kind of to foot the bill? At some point, the American taxpayer is going to say, where's the value for money here? And so, there's got to be, a much bigger emphasis, I think, on the trade and the people-to-people stuff, which is there, but I just don't think it gets as much coverage as the security stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bill, thanks so much for joining me today and for sharing your tremendous insights on the South China Sea. It's always a pleasure to chat to you.
And with you, Ankit, the most knowledgeable person I know on the whole of Asia. So it's been a privilege to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
For listeners, if you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can subscribe at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, anywhere else you get your shows. We're pretty much everywhere. And finally, if you've been a listener for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do so. It really helps get the word out about the show and helps us grow. We really do appreciate that. Thanks a lot for listening, and I'll be back soon with more.